Welcome everyone to this third and last session of our module on monitoring and evaluation. And I'm really delighted that we're joined by James Butler, who some of you met at the session last week. He's very far away in Australia, and he's going to be talking to us today about monitoring and evaluation, participatory monitoring and evaluation in the specific context of conservation conflicts, using lots of examples from around the world. And yeah, I'm particularly delighted because I've been working with James for many years now. He was one of my first interviewees in my PhD research. And since then, we've been working on various bits and pieces. And I think today's session will be incredibly exciting, and I'm looking forward to it. So I'm going to leave this now to James, who's going to introduce himself a little bit more and then start us off on our first part of the session. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, James.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is that sounding okay?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Fine.
Well, thanks for this invitation. Obviously, Justine and Ajay and Juliet and all of you for, to join your merry band. I've learned a lot from the various sessions I've been listening into as a hacker and a formal invitee. So thanks for having me. And in this case, we were trying to think of what I could talk about that would add value to the previous two sessions on monitoring and evaluation. And so I'm just going to share my screen and give you a few slides just to describe some of the stuff we've been doing. Then we'll have some discussion after that, and then some breakout rooms to think about some of the specific questions I'm going to give you. So just share my screen now. Can you see that? Nod? Yes? Excellent. So I just wanted to talk about evaluating adaptive capacity, and as part of that, the capacity for conflict resolution, or in your case, particularly conservation conflict resolution, when you've got stakeholders with differing values, different goals, different objectives over a particular wildlife issue in competition. And the two things are linked, as you'll see. So without further ado, just going sort of half a step back into what Justine was talking about last week. This is the sort of the analogy of a project, an intervention, an initiative, as a sort of a drop in a pond of water, and it has ripple effects. And along those ripple effects, you can place a sort of a theory of change of what the outputs would be, what the outcomes would be, and what the impacts would be. And along that sort of ripple or chain of ripples, you have the implementers who are really involved with the outputs and doing the work. You've got the partners who aren't directly involved, but are definitely relevant and need to be engaged to generate outcomes. And then in terms of the impacts, that's generally speaking, people on the ground, communities, whoever it might be that you're engaging with, who you want to ultimately see the benefit affecting. And of course, the monitoring evaluation is about measuring to what extent those ripples have occurred and where the gaps and the holes are, so that you can address them and eventually get to the impact that you wanted. So some of the questions you might be asking along that sort of that chain is, in terms of outputs, how are we progressing? Do we deliver what we wanted to? Have we done what we said we would do? Is the donor happy that we spent all their money, et cetera, et cetera? Then the outcomes you might be asking is how have the partners changed in terms of their behavior or their capacity? And then ultimately you'd be asking the question, what are the significant and lasting benefits for the beneficiaries on the ground? And so you'd be wanting to measure that as well. And so previously we've been talking about, certainly in the last session, about the outputs and perhaps some of the outcomes, and of course the impacts particularly, and the outcomes tend to take longer to happen. So it's not always that easy to measure them during a project. Often it has to be measured after a project. So it's not so easy, and they tend to be more peripheral and abstract and fluffy, and not that easy to put your finger on. And we talked a little bit about some of those challenges last week. So in terms of what we're interested in and have been interested in measuring in our projects is particularly those outcomes and impacts in terms of adaptive capacity. And what we mean by that is the potential for actors within a system to respond to drivers of change and to shape and create changes in that system. So that's fundamentally really where you want to see impact, I think, in your, or outcomes in your partners. And eventually, if that happens, you might see impact with your beneficiaries as well. And adaptive capacity is a very broad term, but it's very important, not least in this day and age where you've got COVID, you've got climate change, you've got economic shocks, social and ethnic unrest in some places, politics and so on. So to us in our projects, one of the key things we're looking for is, have we built adaptive capacity in our partners particularly and our beneficiary communities to be able to cope with change through our projects? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we've approached this. And this is the sort of the basic theory of change. Again, you have an activity, an intervention, the dollars, and then you expect to see some outcomes, and some of those might be tangible and some might be intangible, the more fluffy things that we've been talking about last week, I think. And then you want to see impacts, usually in terms of livelihoods and ecosystems, some aspects of one or the other or both. But what we have always been interested in is the fact that some of the outcomes we're looking for, actually, particularly amongst our partners, is their capacity to continue with the process of doing whatever they were doing, and looking for those preconditions for them to do that. Because if they can't continue the process of engaging with communities, making change happen, then whatever you did as your activity will just fall flat, as you well know. So it's very important, we think, to be measuring, is that capacity, is that adaptive capacity there amongst your partners, and also possibly amongst your communities too, because if their capacity has been increased to respond and adapt and make sure that the process, whatever process it is you're going through, can be continued, that's important too. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today is the sort of the journey that we've been through to develop indicators that can measure those things, and also methods to measure those things, and crucially, to feed that information back into the system so that it creates a continual learning process through the evaluation over time. And that may not be you that necessarily does that, it may be other people that do that, but they have to be able or enabled to feed information and learning back into the system so it continually evolves and adapts towards, hopefully, the impact that everyone was hoping for. So the first case study I was going to quickly talk about was, I suppose, where we really started with this thinking in Indonesia, where we were looking at livelihoods adapting to climate change in Nusa Tenggara Barat province, which is this square here. That's the islands of Lombok and Sumbawa, and these are very rural populations, very prone to climate fluctuations. And as you can see from this map from the World Food Programme, quite prone as well to food insecurity. So the redder the colour, the more insecure they are. So there were major questions about how climate change was going to affect their food security. And our project was designed to basically follow this theory of change, which went along the line starting in 2010 of phase one, which was priming stakeholders to understand climate change and adaptation. We did a series of planning workshops with multi-stakeholder groups to try and identify the crucial adaptation strategies that were needed. And then we wanted to see if we could trial some of those adaptation strategies with a few pilot projects amongst communities. And that was phase 1. And phase 2 is we assumed that that process, by engaging all the stakeholders, would then end up with the partners, particularly the government planners and politicians, taking up these ideas and implementing them through their planning processes, community development planning processes, which is called musrembang in Indonesia. And they would also change some of their planning processes to be more reflexive and adaptive as a result of us engaging them. And then the third phase was really about implementing adaptation. That's the green phase. And this is where we would see, in theory, these innovations in adaptation being scaled out to many, many different communities, and also a fundamental change in the way that planning is done, so that it can take climate change into account and future uncertainty into account. And the blue line basically shows, going from left to right, how we anticipated that the adaptive capacity of the system that we were dealing with would increase with time as a result of our activities. The dark solid blue line indicates where we had our sphere of control. That was our project, basically. And then we had some influence over phase 2, and then we had very little influence, but were very concerned about phase 3, which would happen after we finished in roughly 2014. So just some photos quickly to illustrate it. So on the top left, you've got the planning processes that we carried out with multi-stakeholder groups, government officials, scientists, community stakeholders, NGOs, etc., etc. And then the bottom 2 photos just show some of the innovative livelihood adaptation strategies we were trying with cassava on the left and seaweed on the right. So in order to do an evaluation, at the end of the project, we had a series of indicators that we wanted to look at in terms of what outcomes we hope to see that would tell us that our theory of change was happening, and crucially, that the capacity for the process of learning and adapting was there to continue. And those are the indicators on the bottom here that have a star against them. What we did is we interviewed our key stakeholders in the project, our key partners, and we asked them to give a score of 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree and 5 being strongly agree, and then they could score between the 2 as well. We asked them to give us a score and give us a story as well around each of these indicators. The first one was, have leaders emerged from the process that can champion the process going forward? The second one was, how much trust has been created? The third was, have communities been empowered through this process? The fourth was, has there been a vision developed for an alternative pathway or an alternative approach to development and adaptation? The next one was, have cross-scale social networks been created that allow people to talk to each other and coordinate where before they couldn't? Was there enhanced knowledge of the problem? Has knowledge or different kinds of knowledge been successfully integrated to solve the problems? And have people started to question their values, norms, and governance of the problem? And then finally, have people come up with creative solutions and innovations? So that's what we were looking for in that first phase of priming the stakeholders. And you can see that those indicators there with stars were the ones where we thought it was really important that those things emerge so that the process can be maintained in our absence, particularly trust and leadership. And then in the second phase, there was another set of indicators looking at particularly resources for implementation, which was important for the process to continue, because if you don't have resources, nothing happens, it just falls flat on its face. And then in the last phase, implementing adaptations, this is where we really wanted to see if innovations were being implemented, looking for new institutions that were emerging to manage the problem, and particularly trying to look at the community level. Does the community actually, in the end, if you look at the very last indicator on the right, does the community have the capacity to live with change, and the one before that, to self-organize for change? So that was how we did it there. And as I say, we did interviews with stakeholders, and the process of interviewing them allowed them to think about the scores that they were giving and the messages they were giving us, and to also discuss a little bit about where the failures might have been. Although in this case, you can see overall we were doing pretty well, and a lot of the scores, these are average scores amongst all the interviews, were actually quite strong and positive. We can discuss later some of the issues around that, perhaps, but for now, that's what the results were that we had. So the next case study I wanted to talk about quickly was seals and salmon in Scotland, which is, as Juliet mentioned, that's where I first met Juliet, because I was working on this particular problem, and this was one of her case studies in her PhD. This really was an issue of conservation conflict, so a lot closer to what you're dealing with. And the fundamental issue here was that you had seals eating salmon, and seals were a protected species in this particular location of Scotland called the Moray Firth, and so were the salmon. And the salmon were protected in certain rivers that flowed into the Moray Firth, and the seals were protected in that Dornoch Firth SAC, which is that shaded area. And the numbers of seals were declining, and the numbers of salmon were declining. And there was a strong suspicion, probably rightly so, that a lot of the fishing stakeholders were shooting the seals because, as you can see from this photo, seals were often seen eating salmon. And so there was a real challenge for myself and latterly Juliet as well, to think about how on earth do you manage this problem. Anyway, in 2005, we started a process of bringing together all the stakeholders on both sides of the divide. And bear in mind that this was a fairly high conflict situation where there was a lot of tension, even really quite nasty stuff going on between all the stakeholders. And it was very hard to bring the two sides of the argument together. But we achieved it, and we started a process of what we called adaptive co-management, where all the stakeholders collaborated together to find solutions to the problem, agree to some compromises about how many seals would be shot, where they would be shot, shot legally, mind you, without threatening the population of seals, and also accepting that, yes, some salmon were going to be eaten, but at certain times of the year that would be mitigated when the salmon were at their most vulnerable. And you can also see here that you've got sweep nets and stake nets marked along the coast, and these were the netsmen, the salmon netsmen, who often suffered the most seal damage because the seals would come into their nets and steal the fish, and that would impact their livelihoods. We kicked off this process in 2005, and it's sort of still going along at the moment. We think the reason being is that we've been back to do evaluations retrospectively over the years. We've done 3 now, which I'll show you the results from in a minute. So what we did here is we divided our indicators out into the outcomes of what was intended, and then also the preconditions, as I just mentioned earlier, for the process to continue. And when we initially did this, we just used some indicators from Plummer and Armitage around adaptive co-management. And you can see here that we've got a list of indicators, and it's very similar to the last graph. We asked stakeholders when we interviewed them in 2011, 6 years after the process started. We asked them to score from 1 to 5, and then and that was basically from disagree to strongly agree. And as you can see on the scale here, we actually changed the scale slightly, but it's still effectively the same story. We asked them to score against each of these outcome indicators how they thought what was called the Moray Firth Seal Management Plan was actually tracking. So you can see we've got first order parameters which are tangible, first order parameters which are intangible, second order parameters and third order parameters. And they range around things like resource management plans, conflict resolution, agreed sanctions. If something goes wrong, everyone agrees what should be done about it, new institutional arrangements, greater adaptive capacity, social and human capital, creative ideas for problem solving, questioning of routines and values and governance. And you heard that from the previous list of indicators in Indonesia. And then the remaining indicators in the second order and the third order were more about changes in perceptions and actions, engagement and learning across scales, addressing other issues within the problem as a result of the capacity that had been generated, and ongoing cooperative approaches, and as I mentioned before, local learning to live with uncertainty as well. So to what extent were these stakeholders able to actually deal with other issues as well as the one that we were talking about? And for the precondition indicators, we used, again, Plummer and Armitage's 6 indicators. And in this case, we were able to compare between 2005 when it started and 2011. So we compared the scores that people gave us. And 2005 is in gray and 2011 is in white. And you can see that there were some changes over that period. The adaptable portfolio of management measures had increased as the process had gone on, but the commitment to long-term institution building had declined, basically because once the government had set the whole thing up with us and the stakeholders, they pulled back and a bit of energy went out of the process. Provision of training, capacity building and resources, that had declined slightly. Leaders prepared to champion the process, which, as I mentioned earlier, was an important one, that had declined significantly and was a significant weakness, we thought, of the process. And then stakeholders sharing and drawing on a plurality of knowledge, different knowledge types, that had also declined. And the policy environment supportive of collaborative management, that had stayed similar but slightly declined. So we learned from that there were certain things that needed to be done to keep the Murray Firth Seal Management Plan on track. And we fed this information back to all the stakeholders to try and rectify some of those weaknesses. And then what we did after that is we actually adapted or changed the indicators slightly, Juliet and I, to try and incorporate more on the conservation conflict side of the process and the outcomes and the preconditions. And in this case, we went back and did another evaluation in 2015 with Thea Cox, a student of ours. This is from her recent paper. And what we did is we added, in this case, to the outcome indicators, a couple that were specific to the conservation conflict issue. And those are with the red stars that you can see. So the first few there are sort of a synopsis of the previous outcome indicators that we had: new institutional arrangements, new institutions codified in law, questioning of routines, values and governance, legitimization of policies and actions, agreed upon sanctions, creative ideas for problem solving, engagement and learning across scales, changes in perceptions and actions, and resource management plans. So they were in our previous set of indicators. But what we added, first of all, was to what extent was the outcome of the process acceptable to all parties on both sides? To what extent were parties not asserting their interests to the detriment of others? And to what extent was there an acceptable conservation status of the contested species, for salmon in this case, and the same for the other species, in this case, seals? And what we found, which is quite interesting as a result of asking these questions, is that the outcome acceptable to all parties was pretty weak. And in fact, you can see some people from the range of scores said that actually it wasn't good. Then in terms of the acceptable conservation status of contested species, the reason was that salmon were considered to be still in decline. And that was the major reason why people were not happy. The process was not managing to maintain the status of salmon and seals. The seals, on the other hand, were doing okay. So immediately we picked out from, by adding those extra indicators, that there was some significant friction re-emerging some 10 years after the process started. In terms of the precondition indicators, we were able to compare these between 2005 when the process started, that's in the blue, 2011 when we did our first evaluation, and then 2015 when we did our second one. And so we were able to track the changes there as well. But again, we added here 6 new indicators to really capture what we thought was important for the conservation conflict process to continue. And those were formal and regular evaluations, and as a proper stakeholder learning process, quality of information and resources, the transparency of stakeholders' goals and values, trust amongst stakeholders, again, very important, the presence of a bridging organization or individual or facilitator, and finally, participation of all impacted stakeholders. And what you can see for those last 6 indicators, starting with the formal and regular evaluation, people felt that had been quite strong in 2005, but had fallen back. Ditto the quality of information and resources, the same thing. It wasn't too bad to start with, but was declining. The transparency of stakeholders' goals and values had actually remained the same, which was good. Trust amongst stakeholders also seemed to be declining. The presence of a bridging organization or individual had fallen dramatically, particularly between 2005 and 2011. And the participation of all impacted stakeholders had also declined. So the overall indication was that, a bit like as reflected in the outcomes, there were weaknesses emerging, and if people didn't take rectifying action, the whole process of conflict resolution could well just go back to where it had been prior to 2005. So I just wanted to say a few words about participatory evaluation and why it's important. This is just photographs from the Indonesian case study, where we brought together the primary stakeholders and partners that I mentioned before, and we reviewed our theory of change. We asked them to contribute through various other tools as well, and we also conducted the interviews with them and fed the information back to them as well once we had the results. One of the problems is that, as you can imagine, you interview everyone, you take transcripts of what they say, you go away and you analyze all the results, and then how do you feed that information back again? You can give them graphs, you can give them a report, but really the best way to feed it back is to have another workshop with them to actually discuss the results. So where was the process weak? Why were those issues emerging? And what needs to be done to rectify that? And very often, particularly if you're working in remote areas, or in our case, between Australia and Indonesia, it's hard to justify that, that revisiting with your stakeholders, which is why ultimately it's really important, we think, to build the capacity of your partners to be able to do this themselves. And then they can do it in situ, on site, and generate their own learning culture and their own methods even of doing this, and perhaps even their own indicators. So that was definitely a weakness of what we were doing, because we were remote and it wasn't so easy to feed the information back. But we did train our partners how to do this. And apparently, relative to all the climate adaptation ideas that we had, the one thing that's really stuck amongst all of them is how to do this participatory evaluation, and how valuable it is, not just for this project and the outcomes and impacts of our project, but for all the other projects they do as well. So really it was the major, I think, accomplishment of what we did in this particular adaptation project. So it was very, very little about, in the end, seeing community adaptation on a broad scale. It was much more about seeing the adaptive capacity of our partners increase dramatically. So why is participatory evaluation then so valuable? I mean, in principle, it empowers the people in the system to make change. And as I showed earlier, it can create that adaptive feedback loop so that people can learn and adapt and change and push on with the process that you may have started as an implementer of a project. And in theory, if you can get that sort of culture embedded, as we did in Indonesia, it makes the whole system more adaptive. Not entirely, but it certainly helps. And so if you've got other problems emerging, like climate change in your case, or COVID-19, in theory at least, people should be better capable of responding to those issues than they would have been otherwise. So it promotes social learning and knowledge generation amongst everybody. Also amongst us as researchers and implementers, remember, we're also part of the system. It can also tackle power issues and the root causes of problems. In our Indonesian project, you know, although we got very positive results initially, the weaknesses we uncovered were definitely around politics and power, and the fact that we really hadn't anticipated properly or analyzed properly the power dynamics amongst the stakeholders and how that would impact our project. And I'm sure you all have come across that as well in everything that you do. So it wasn't entirely successful, but it did at least expose these issues and the way that we should be tackling them in future. I think it's also useful for building the legitimacy of local stakeholders, for example, to donors, so that they can report themselves back to the donors rather than the implementers having to do it all the time. And so in some ways that then gives them a more direct linkage back to the donors, and potentially then seeing funding flowing directly to them in the future rather than through you as an implementer. And of course, it can still be used for accountability reporting. The stories that you get from the evaluations can be put into a format that you can report, like the indicator scores, for example. Although it may not be as specific as the sorts of indicators we talked about last week, like numbers of animals vaccinated or numbers, amount of income coming into households, for example. But also one thing that has been published quite recently, a paper, was about the personal growth that local partners and stakeholders can feel when they learn how to do participatory evaluation and then do it themselves. And the quote that was in this paper, which I thought was quite nice, is about fishermen in this case in Mexico. He learns to be more than a fisher. He learns more, he grows as a person. So it's all about empowering and building capacity and enabling people actually to take control of their own initiatives and grow themselves as a person, which doesn't just benefit your project, but potentially everything that they're involved with. So that's basically it for now. These are the 3 questions that we're going to give you for the breakout groups in about sort of 20 minutes, half an hour's time. Just wanted you to think about what are the limitations of participatory evaluation. I haven't touched on them completely, deliberately. That's for us to discuss later, perhaps. But also, how do you manage these limitations? I did discuss one about us being remote, taking the results away, these indicator scores and outcomes from the interviews, and then feeding them back remotely. That's one issue, obviously, but there may be others, and we may have to think about how to manage those. And then the third question really relates to what I just said as well, is that how do you feed that information back to stakeholders so that it creates that vital learning cycle and adaptive loop? So we'll come back to those questions for the breakout rooms, but just for now, we thought that we'd maybe just allow a bit of discussion about particularly some of the indicators. I know there was quite a lot of information there to digest, so apologies for that. But I can clarify that by going back over some of them if you like. Talk about maybe some of the methods that we use to actually gather the information as well. And, you know, also it'd be interesting to see what you think about the whole issue more broadly about how you measure adaptive capacity and perhaps conflict conservation resolution as well, and whether you think any of these indicators would be useful for you, and perhaps you might want to add some as well that aren't there. Anyway, maybe we'll just leave it there, Justine and Juliet, and have open up a bit of a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Yes, so I think there's actually already a question on the chat from Deepshika. I don't know, Deepshika, whether you want to put that question to James?
Yeah, so like when I look at the questions, I felt that they were a little positive leaning, like people, if they agreed to it, it was that was a positive, is there a reason why they have been placed in such a way so that if it's agreed, it's better, and if it's disagreed, it's not good or something?
Yeah, good point. No, not really. I mean, I think if just go back to those graphs, yes, you're right. So this is what you're referring to, I think, in terms of negatives and positives, or disagreeing versus disagree being negative and agree being positive. Yeah. It's a good question, actually. We didn't really think about it very much. I mean, generally we took the numbers off when we were talking back to our stakeholders. In the papers that we published, we kept the scores on just so that you could see how we did it. But when we fed the information back, we didn't make a big deal about minus or positive. Yeah, but that's a very good point. In terms of I don't know what's the word, sort of stigmatizing disagreement.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. Is that what you meant? I think
that was what I was getting at. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, understood. Yeah. No, good point.
Yeah, it is actually a really good point. I hadn't considered that at all before, and I would imagine maybe depending on different cultural contexts, that could actually play quite a big role. I'm not sure. I think for the one that you're showing now, James, I personally wouldn't think that that's biased the results particularly anyway, because as we can see, the results are not that positive anyway. So I'm not sure that in this context of the Moray Firth it did bias things, but yes, it's true that in different cultural contexts that might be something that needs to be considered more. Or maybe mixing.
It's worth just adding. Yeah, I was going to say just to clarify, when we did the interviews, I'm not sure about the Moray Firth, but certainly in Indonesia, I remember just saying, would you agree or disagree, or strongly agree, maybe, disagree, strongly disagree. And we did give them the option of 1 to 5 so that they could say, oh, well, yeah, that's a maybe. So that would be a, whatever it was, a 3. That I agree with that. That's a 4, not a 5. No, just a 4. So in our case, at least for Indonesia, we didn't use minuses and pluses when we talked to them. We just had a scale, like typical Likert scale of 1 to 5 or 0 to 5. But you're right. It is potentially a tripwire if you're not careful. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that was a good clarification, James. Thank you. Right, there's a question from Manvi. Manvi, would you like to pose your question to James?
Yeah, thanks, James. So my question is related to new knowledge being generated and how best can that be incorporated in the system. Maybe it's a bit abstract. Maybe I can concretize it a bit. For example, if you think of the salmon and the seals problem, if the populations change in one way or the other, how can we best quickly incorporate that new information, and what's the best way to incorporate that new knowledge into the system to make people change their earlier behavior?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, funnily enough, Juliet, I think that was a comment from a reviewer of the paper, actually, who said exactly that thing. Remember? So it's well picked up in that people's perception of the status of, let's say, seals is what they perceive, right? It may not be based on fact, although it's their own reality. Bear that in mind. So if you say to them in an interview and they say, "Oh no, the seals have, they've declined, but terribly," and then you pull out a piece of paper and say, "Well, actually, our monitoring says that their numbers are increasing," you're setting up a little bit of almost a power dynamic between the science and what they think. And they'll say, "Oh no, I go down to the beach every afternoon and walk my dog, and there's seals everywhere. There's but there's not as many as there used to be." And so, you've got that tension there by setting that discussion up between what they believe and your information. And so you're dead right. How do you feed back into the process, maybe not in the evaluation itself, but in the general process, that new information? And in a way, that should be captured, that mechanism should be captured in some of the other indicators. For example, as you said, I think engagement and learning across scales. If that information was being fed back in through regular meetings and so on, then that might be something that would give you a more positive score or a positive response anyway to that other indicator. So yeah, I think you're right. It's how you incorporate other forms of information is important. And I think I think for the Murray-Firth, we looked at, if you look down at indicator number 8, quality of information and resources, I think that was one reason we added that in, was deliberately to try and capture to what extent good data, good information was actually being used, like, let's say, population censuses in the process. So that's a bit of a garbled response, but I think it's a really good.
That helped. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Manvi.
Great, thank you, Manvi. We've also got a question from Becky. Becky, would you like to ask the question?
Yeah, thank you. It would be helpful if you're able to share a link to your paper about the indicators of conservation conflict, and I was wondering whether how you came up with the indicators and also the wording of these, because sometimes the wording might make sense to in certain situations and cultures, but not to others. And did you sort of do a bit of a piloting or a testing with stakeholders to check that the wording did make sense and the indicators actually did make sense and you weren't missing anything?
Yeah, no, very good question. And in different cultural contexts, different words mean different things. So, for example, in Papua New Guinea, we have to not change you keep the main intent of the indicator or the question about the indicator, but the words that you use are completely different. So yes, that's very problematic, and maybe something we discuss later. And then also, therefore, comparing results between different cultural contexts is not necessarily that robust either, because you may have different interpretations and the way that the answers are given and so on. So in general, you're absolutely right that the words mean everything. In terms of the Murray-Firth, yeah, we did do, I think, pilot interviews before we did these. And although these are indicators, they're just, whatever it is, adaptable portfolio of management measures, that was translated into a question with some examples that was then put to the stakeholder or the interviewee, and you can find those in the details of the paper. Yeah, and I think that, but going back to the first my first response, how you how you transpose these questions and the intent of the indicators into your local context is very, very important. And you're right, you've got to test it, otherwise people just look blank. And what do you mean by rules and governance? You know, that might mean one thing in one place and another thing in another. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That's got to be very carefully contextualized. Yeah.
So could I just add a couple of things to that, James? In terms of the first bit of the question, which was, you know, how these indicators were developed in the first place, that was really based on theory. So there was quite a lot of work, as I recall, James, that went into picking up various indicators that had already been identified in adaptive management papers and practice previously, which we then adapted and built on with the sort of conservation conflict dynamic. So the indicators at the beginning, that you know, these 12 preconditions and other indicators were very much based on a very, very strong theoretical basis, and then came the adaptation, you know, to the local context. But as you say, keeping the essence, if you like, of those indicators that were based on theory very much as they were. And just to add, in the pilot interviews, but then also in the actual interviews, there was quite a bit of work, not only on you know, writing a question that was understandable by all, but also on checking that the understanding of the interviewee was what we wanted. As in, you know, it wasn't just asked and then that was it. There was definitely work on the part of the interviewer to check that, you know, that the understanding was actually shared between the interviewee and the interviewer. And I think that may also address the question from Janaki, you know, on how you word these questions in such a complex indicator, and were there a couple of questions for each indicator, and was individual biases taken into account? So again, yes, I would say that really depends on the context. So I'm using this set of indicators now for another conflict around sea eagles, and in that context, we are definitely breaking down into sort of 2 or sometimes 3 questions each of these indicators, because of the actual context that conflict is in. So I think that's quite important to add. So we've also now got a question from Justine.
Hey, hi, thanks, Juliet. Thanks, James, for the really nice examples and sharing these. This is, I think, really pertinent, especially to the snow leopard world. I see many similarities related to the conflict and the climate change. But I was wondering, it's a question I think that relates to maybe my previous presentations in the first 2 sessions relating to contribution. Like, you know, many is a system, right? And there's so much going on. So as you said, you had very low control on the later indicators. How, or maybe you weren't interested in whether the program was actually contributed to that. You were more just interested that those were in place. So I just wanted to ask, was there any attempt to kind of assess contribution to those indicators?
Yeah, or attribution, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And further down that you know, the sort of the system, as the ripples go out, as you say, the harder it is to actually identify attribution. So we did definitely look for attribution in the outcomes in terms of adaptive capacity and so on, and identify to what extent we had been responsible for those outcomes. But once you get into the implementing space, it got much harder. As you can imagine, because there's all sorts of other programs and projects going on at the same time. And so that all we could really do there was say, well, we had some effect. We can't really say how much, and your interviewees probably, and I don't want to, you know, muck up our discussion in the breakout groups, but they may have said or given you a positive or more of a positive response than was possibly true, just because they wanted to please you and make you feel good and say thank you and so on. So you know, that there's all that bias that comes into that sort of impact end of the theory of change and attribution as well. And so to what extent you could actually take people's word for it was, you know, hard. But I think luckily if you've got a donor that understands development and change, they recognize that too. And so they're not looking for, you know, a brand new world attributed solely to your project. They understand that that's not feasible. But some stories that where you can show your project actually did flow through all the way to a specific impact is probably okay for them. And in our case, we had that kind of donor who was happy to accept that and understand that what we were doing was contributing to something that was a much bigger system and a much bigger process. But I certainly think in the outcome space, you can have a lot more attribution or contribution and pin it down. And I mentioned earlier that one of the key things that came out of our Indonesian project was actually just how to do participatory evaluation. And that was solely attributable to us. No one had ever done that with these partners before. And that was their biggest take-home wow moment. And they still use it to this day, you know, sort of 6 years later. So it is possible, I think, in the outcomes to get some contribution, albeit qualitative, not necessarily quantitative.
Thanks, James. And just to add another quick question, do you have examples of some of those tools on participatory, like theory of change and others that you guys put into place?
Yeah, I was going to show them, and I thought it would take too long to explain it all. First we did this, then we did that, and then. But yes, there were various methods which we developed, including these indicators, and not just the indicators, but the stories around each indicator that emerged. Yeah, I mean, I think I was, yeah, some of it's in that slide, actually, the slides that I sent you originally a couple of weeks ago that I was going to show today, and then decided to change it slightly. But yeah, they are there, and they're pretty simple. And I'm sure that there are other ones we haven't thought about that other people use that you could add to a sort of a toolbox of methods. That might be worth thinking about, actually.
Oh, sorry, I was thinking about that answer, which is which is great. So we do have another question now from Altinai. Would you like to ask that question? Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So I was wondering, since I had briefly looked at your paper about seals and salmon fishing, and in the outcomes you said that the fishermen were like overrepresented, or basically the most interviewees were fishermen, and this influenced the results of the study. And I was wondering, is there any practice of maybe giving weight or some other practice of basically, yeah, making this more objective, the results?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, I don't want to spoil too much the breakout room discussions, because these are all issues you have to think about, and there's no simple solution to any of them. You know, one key problem is availability of stakeholders, and eventually you just have to take who you can get, particularly if you're doing repeat surveys like we did over the years. People move on, people change jobs and so on, so it's very hard to have a consistent set of, or if you like, to control for that kind of variation, statistically speaking. So yes, you could weight them maybe if you're getting too many of one kind of stakeholder and not enough for another. Or you could just put health warnings over your results, which is what we did. But I think what's missing from my presentation and is very rich and is very hard to capture in a paper as well is the stories that come out. And even if you've got 6 fishermen telling you the same story, and then one, let's say, tourism operator telling you another, although statistically that's not very valid or strong, you still at least know that there's 2 different discourses going on. And that tells you at least that even if your indicator score is slightly dodgy for those reasons, for, you know, because of the numbers involved, you still know that there's something going on that needs to be dealt with. So I think to some extent, yes, put a health warning over the indicators. You can't really correct, I don't think, for weighting or whatever. I mean, you can if you like, but it gets quite complicated. I think what really matters is getting the story and the different stories that are coming out from the different stakeholders about, let's say in this case, the seals and the salmon. And that's what you need to respond to. Juliet, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really fits nicely with our discussion last week around quantitative and qualitative indicators. And in this case, with the seal salmon conflict, it really was a case of quantitative and qualitative. So for each of those indicators, we obviously asked for a quantitative score, but we also asked them for their interpretation of that score, which became our sort of qualitative element. And I completely agree with you, James, that then there's there's very rich material coming out from that more qualitative side of things, which can then either be used to, really sort of corroborate the quantitative elements, or actually to sort of bring out some of the elements that might not be coming through the scoring system, but are, fundamentally key to the discussion, especially when part of the reason for us doing the seal salmon, the continued seal salmon evaluation, was also to sort of maybe highlight some of the things that, as Justine was highlighting, some of those sort of external factors that were coming up and could actually make quite a big difference in the conflict. So, really with that sort of view of planning ahead and being maybe a little bit more proactive in the conflict rather than just reacting to these wider external forces, that qualitative element, I think, was really key.
Yeah, definitely.
But perhaps maybe add that qualitative element was possible because we didn't have a huge number of interviewees. So then you've got, an extra element of dealing with them with quite a lot of data if you're doing qualitative elements as well. Super. Right, well, I think we've got through the questions on the chat. I'm not sure if there are any other questions that people would like to ask at this stage. I'm not seeing anyone. So I think we're probably all right to maybe move on to the breakout.
Juliet, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, this is Manvi.
Hi, Manvi.
Hi. I was James. I was looking at all the indicators that that some of them have changed over these years, and some haven't changed. And because there's so many indicators, and just because of an urge to simplify things, would you say that indicators that haven't changed over these years, would it be reasonable to drop them, or what can that tell us about the system?
You mean haven't changed in their score rather than
in the score?
The indicator itself. Yeah. No, I think often, as Juliet just said now, if there's a positive story behind why that's the case, that can often be a source of strength or inspiration that could help with some of the other issues that you're dealing with. You may have a really strong leader, for example, who's there and doing a great job, but there's other stuff that's happening which is out with their control. But then you know that you've got a strong leader or good leadership to lean on in order to sort out the other problems. So you're right. I mean, it is tempting to drop stuff which doesn't seem relevant, particularly if it's always positive, maybe, rather than negative, where you start to worry about it. But I still think there's value maybe in keeping it, which of course means more material, more results, more reporting, etc., etc. But yeah, my instinct would be don't drop stuff. But equally, maybe don't add too much either, because it just gets unwieldy. But and in a way, so what we did, Juliet and I, in the Murray Firth with the seals and the salmon over the years, we sort of refined the indicators anyway around the conservation conflict issue. So we adapted it slightly for that. We didn't drop anything really. If anything, we added stuff. And for the climate adaptation stuff that we've done, we haven't dropped anything. We've tried to keep it all there. Yeah, I think that would be my instinct.